let's dive into it. First, a little bit of background for myself is, I guess most people know me, and that's why I'm on this show as well, is because in 2009 I did the DevOps days, but I also do a lot of organizers stuff. I did the first chef training, I was speaker at Velocity, wrote in a couple of books. It's not to show off, but I mean, it's been part of my life since 2009. And what's interesting now is that if you look at the bottom, you will see a little company, Small Town Heroes. It's not known, but it's actually doing DevOps, but in another area. So I just wanted to point out that, even though I started to do a lot of things in technology, I'm getting closer to the business. Okay, so the journey of 5 years of DevOps, this is kind of how I visualized it. You mentioned before that people might have been doing parts of DevOps before, even before 2009. So you see at the bottom of this picture, people have been doing cloud, continuous delivery wasn't new when it was like the word DevOps came out. Agile was there, lean startup wasn't new. So all these kind of paths seem to converge at the DevOps days in Ghent. The name DevOps was kind of an accident because initially it was like Agile System Administration Collaboration, but that would be too long for a conference. So we named it DevOps Days. And I think it was just the zeitgeist of all these things coming together as one thing. So it can totally be normal. You've been doing parts of that before, even 2009. From there, we kind of grew from a blog post, what is DevOps, to a newsletter, more DevOps Days, the Phoenix Project book, people from Gartner picking it up. And then there's all kind of side things like monitoring log, infracoders, typically on configuration management. There was an attempt to trademark DevOps, which is kind of interesting, but it got overruled by the government. And you see there's like this starting point gave birth to little different parts and nuggets that, learned and expanded different parts. For example, rugged DevOps is something that's specifically on security, trying to help things. Something that's recently come out is the whole thing on empathy, is that it's collaboration, but one of the newer terms that keeps popping up is empathy. And you'll see there's, I think this year and kind of last year already, DevOps for network. People kind of got up. Cisco is getting big in the space. They're trying to evolve. And if there's one thing I would say that 2014 is I think it's the year of the DevOps enterprise. So I don't know if that makes sense to you, Mark, that journey?
Yeah, it does. I was trying just to see the momentum. How does an idea, sort of a group, in 2009, and and it takes this idea of a get together, and how does it turn into a movement, and how does the momentum grow? You guys did not really have in 2009 when you first had the first DevOps days. You didn't go out and say, "Hey, we need to create a movement." No. What were you thinking?
Well, I think the thinking was more like, let's exchange these feelings. And was a lot of people already working in agile teams like, hey, there's this extra mile, and there's new ways. You need more flexibility in your operations. And we were kind of discussing that. And I think one of the parts that made it succeed without, having commercial backing or, promo or whatever, is the fact that everybody understood the pain of that collaboration point that wasn't happening. So just the word was so clear to people where the pressure point was. If you ever stood in that wall of confusion somewhere between those two, that's a pain. And because so many people have lived that pain, it was an easy thing to spread.
Yes.
Yeah. It's not an easy thing to solve, but
yes,
it is an easy thing to understand.
It's a simple concept to really sort of understand, right, is, that sort of all facets of your technology organization must be aligned towards a common goal, right, of rapidly producing high-quality software, period.
Yeah. And also the human part of collaboration and not being yelled at and, working together, that's an equal part. Like being treated as humans, not throw things over the wall. That's beyond, just delivery and technology. It's just the fact that you feel respected and you feel that you're part of the system that can make a difference within a company. So there's a lot to talk about this slide, and, if you Google some words, you will find whether IT skeptic or monitoring log or side process. But I thought it was most interesting for the audience of this webinar to kind of go into, DevOps and the enterprise. And there's been a lot of debate in the community whether, DevOps in an enterprise is different as in a startup. I think the same patterns apply, or the same thinking, but obviously the scale is a lot harder. So it's one of the things you have to be aware of, is that I've seen people from enterprise kind of dismiss things that are done in startups or in web operation part, but I think you can equally apply things, but you just have to listen to go to the next step in DevOps, and that's an important part. So maybe one of the first parts, and I think it came up in the first revision of DevOps Day, is that people want a DevOps manifesto, like the Agile manifesto, a simple description on what it is and how it should be. And I must, in a way, apologize to people that there isn't one, because what I've seen, if you compare the writings of ITIL, was it 9 books or something, or 15 books at its peak, and still it confuses people what it is. And then, okay, Agile was lighter, but it still confuses people what it is. So I feel like the moment we write that down, what it actually is, it will limit the fact that, it's in or it's out. The idea is in or it's out. And I always wanted to have the idea expand, and that's one of the reasons why I deliberately didn't want to write a DevOps manifesto in there. So I don't know if you agree with that, or you want.
No, I think that's a very interesting thing, because when you look at DevOps, and at least you've talked about it, a lot of people talk that it's not necessarily something new. It's rooted in Agile and Lean, so it borrows from stuff, and it may borrow from other stuff, right? So it seems like it's constantly evolving. I do see people tend to gravitate towards sort of at least the high-level Agile manifesto, of the idea of individuals and interactions over processes and tools and working systems, and customer collaboration over contract, that stuff, which sort of makes sense, But I do understand, the thinking in that if you have one, then it's harder to evolve, and this is an evolving sort of culture and movement.
Yeah, I think if you reread whether it's the ITIL books in a way, to become more robust and reliant, and especially in ITIL version 3, you will see a lot of the continuous delivery and fast feedback cycles come back. And if you read Agile, of course, you should replace software with system or service. You don't have to rewrite it again. And we would just be copying that same point. But I think that the acronym that came up in a couple of years after DevOps there was CAMS. And it's the acronym of collaboration, automation, measurement, and sharing. And that kind of encapsulates a lot of the moving parts within DevOps that we discuss. And note that it isn't just automation, getting the things faster, configuration management or whatever deployment system we're talking. It's also thinking about the feedback in measurement, so monitoring metrics, everything you get back. And you do that by not only putting the technology in place, but by collaborating, by, for example, instrumenting your code with metrics or making your code easy to automate. And then you share that stuff. So I often see people say, I have this Puppet script here or Chef or whatever, and we're doing DevOps. And I can sometimes think, okay, but are you sharing it within your group? Is anybody using it? If you're doing it only for yourself, I wouldn't call that DevOps because I kind of miss the collaboration part, what you're trying to do. So for me, this acronym, and for many people, this has stood out as kind of embodying what we would be looking for in DevOps. Some people add the L for plan, for lean, or something. So it's kind of an evolving, but that seems to be the kind of the standard, what people are going for.
Yeah, and then there's, sort of practices underneath it, would you say, Patrick? Like things like continuous delivery, would that sort of fall underneath this, possibly? Or where do you see things like that? Infrastructure as code, where do you see things like that falling?
Yeah, so continuous delivery, when you read the seminal book that was written, there's a lot of making deployment faster. And there was testing of the code and then deploying it, but there wasn't that much yet on monitoring and feedback in that book. Yes. So a lot of the infrastructure as code would be in automation, but parts of it, if you instrument that right and you instrument your code right, and you, for example, you reuse your testing, for example, your end-user testing as a way to monitoring things, then you can enter the M for monitoring metrics and get the feedback of things going. So I know the people who wrote the book, and I know they intended, but it isn't that clear in continuous delivery. It seems to be more focused like how fast can we get things out, and less about how much can we learn once it's in production so we can adapt. And that's where the measurement comes in. And there has been a form of collaboration, but it hasn't been made explicit that, there is clear communication, collaboration between the two groups, and that's equal part of attention, and not let's automate the pipeline so nobody has to talk to each other.
Yeah.
I've seen that happen, and then when it fails, everybody starts finger pointing again. That's not the point. Well, pun intended, but.
I see. Yeah. So here's an example. Like postmortems. So you can take a DevOps methodology on like postmortems, right? That's an example. Yeah.
And that's something you could say, well, to get the information of your postmortem, you'll probably do metrics and see and collect all that information. But it's not necessarily, because it could be in a procedure or where your bottleneck is, or, it could be the fact that all your documentation is stored in a wiki, and if that one server goes down, you don't have any information. It isn't about the automation and the measurement there, but it's kind of the sharing and making that blameless between people in the process.
Yeah. So DevOps methodology is really sort of a way of doing something, and that's inclusive of these principles.
Yeah, correctly. Yeah. So for me, I kind of over the years distilled a little model on how I think like a lot of the practices you can put them in. And I call that, the 4 areas of DevOps. And a lot of the initial projects within company would expand on what in the picture is area 1. It's like, how do you get better or faster to production? It's typically the continuous delivery. You work on the pipeline. You make all that happen. So the automation in CAMs is area 1. And then once they get more mature in that delivery, they will think about like, how can we get the information out of the operational side so that devs can see what happens. So that's typically metrics, monitoring, exposing of log file, all the information that the devs need, kind of get the visibility, so it isn't just a wall and they have to ask or they have to wait for somebody to make an FTP of a log file or something. It's kind of that extension. Area 1 and Area 2 are typically more technology focused when they're being implemented into a company. And then I see a bigger cycle between Area 1 and Area 2, which is between Area 3 and Area 4. It's kind of how do you not just, deliver the software and make it better, but how do you embed the knowledge of the project into operations? Like, it's not that you can put the software faster in the hands of operations. How do you make sure they understand what the new change is? It's one of the practices that people have been doing. For example, at Google or other companies, they have for when the first things go live of a new product or a new idea or a new release, they make the devs on call. And making the devs on call is a great way to actually embed the knowledge of the project people into the operational side, because they know best what changed, they know the core internals, they know where it might be breaking, how to handle failures better, and so on. And then when you get the feedback from them, the idea is that once you've run your project in production, you want to take that knowledge for your next project. So you want to make sure, for example, there's a performance bug or there's an issue with people logging in and losing their sessions, something like that, is how do you make sure it gets on the backlog of your project, that it gets the attention that it deserves, and it isn't like locally optimized fix in operations only, but there is like a structural fix in the actual product. So that's kind of the 4 areas that I distilled the practices that people have been doing on that. And it isn't necessary, but usually it starts in Area 1, Area 2, and then goes to 3 and 4, depending on how they evolve. I do an interesting exercise on mapping infrastructures of organization. And when I ask them, can you draw your production environment? People would, put their load balancers, web servers, and all that stuff on the board. But if that company is getting really mature, you will see that their delivery system in their dev environment is considered part of their production environment, because their releases go through the pipeline and from the dev environment as well. So you see, this is kind of the maturity that people get while they're enhancing things in the different areas. So let me go to the next slide. If you want to take this a little bit further, within these areas, you would see the typical layers like people, process, and tools, where you can kind of put the practices in. And if you want to get really fancy, you can, make also kind of maturity levels in each of the areas. Typically, the first initiatives would make the Area 1 more mature, and then they go to the next area. But, of course, nothing is blocking you, for making Area 2 or 4 immediately at a different maturity level. So you can even map it. A lot of the enterprise people might be familiar with the CNMI levels of maturity, where you can kind of see at each level where to do it. So I typically visualize it as a big bucket of water, where you have the sides of the bucket, like a wooden bucket, and then if one is too low, the water will leak from that side. And I think that's the trick when you start DevOps initiatives, is that you find where water leaks out. And it might not be in your Area 1, although a lot of people think that, when I have to start a DevOps initiative, it is in Area 1, but it might not necessarily be there. So I don't know if you've seen this trend as well, that people start in area one when we do DevOps projects.
Yeah, typically, I mean, again, quick wins would be in the area of sort of automating deployments as an example, this kind of stuff. But you're amazed, and I agree with you, is having, that whole concept, if I'm awake, you're awake, having development available for the deploy, how making that kind of change, and sometimes that change is difficult culturally, but how making that change can make such a big improvement in reliability of deployments.
Yeah, absolutely.
More of a cultural thing.
Yeah. So, I'm going to skip to these slides, but it's kind of cataloging the practices. One of the things, this is an example: provision, dev, and test and prod from the same source. It's a very simple thing. You do it in the area of delivery to prod, so area one, and then you start using configuration method. So this is a typically info level of things. One thing you want to make sure of is, like, let's say you have those 4 areas and you start addressing one bottleneck. I've seen people, go crazy on area one only and not address any of the others. And the trick is to understand that when you change the system that you're working in, whether that's at the tool level or at the process level or, at the project level, your bottleneck will change. And it will just move from, area 1 to area 2 or maybe somewhere else. And I think that's the constant factor of, if people say, I'm doing this and this is DevOps, and I'm doing this is DevOps, well, within their company, they have, different bottlenecks. And it might not be your first or most important bottleneck that you have to address in your company, but, it is a valid point that for them, it might take, there is a reason to address that. And when it really gets worse, if the bottleneck isn't in dev and ops, but, for example, it's in your, HR department. They're hiring different people, not the ones who move. So that your bottleneck just starts to move, and then it gets scary if the bottleneck is something you cannot do something about. So, but I agree. A lot of people will just go into DevOps with the fact that they're DevOps is the tools, and they're pretty cool. I made a whole presentation on that. The link is at the bottom. There is this kind of interaction between introducing a new tool and changing a culture. It's not necessarily that introducing a new tool will change the culture, but it can change the culture. The fact that you're using a config management tool might make you rethink the way you work. Or when you introduce cloud, you rethink the way you work. And that's maybe a good example is a tool like Vagrant, which was so interesting because now both dev and ops were using the same tool within their daily work. And the fact that they're using the same tool made it possible for them to actually have a dialogue on something that they can experiment and learn from. So I wouldn't say that DevOps tool, people say, is there a DevOps tool? No, but you can apply a lot of tools in a DevOps way, in my opinion. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit on it. If you look at culture as a sort of this system of learned behavior patterns, right? And tools don't necessarily change culture, but they can change behavior.
Yeah, absolutely.
Influence behavior. And it sort of got me thinking so you can have a tool that can influence behavior, and it might be automation, it might be about sharing or measuring, along the lines of your principles, but are there other cultural tools? And that's an interesting possible topic on how that lays out. But clearly, you can't take one without the other. Tools are influential, but some people get way too obsessed about it, like us vendors.
Yeah, I understand that, you have to make a living and you put the word DevOps on there, you promote your tool. And obviously you mean that with the best intentions, automation helps people to, collaborate and so on. It's just something you need to be aware about. If somebody tries to sell you a DevOps tool, what do you mean? And how is this actually going to help us in collaboration and so on? And that's kind of the part you need to be looking at is buying the tool is only one thing, but how you're going to introduce that and, how's that going to make a difference for you as a process or sitting people together or sharing the code base or stuff like that. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. So, typically in an enterprise, you will have people that will sell you those tools or try to sell you those tools. I would say, ignore the fact that they're putting the label DevOps on there and just listen how the tools can help you, get that work done better and, more pleasantly as well. So you start the DevOps initiative, you've kind of identified a bottleneck, you get all excited about the tool, and then in an enterprise, you would be looking for people, either internally or externally. And then I see companies write their, what's the correct name in English? Not the resume, but, the job description. And they say, well, we have a DevOps opportunity. And what's interesting, very often, I'm not saying always, but very often when you read that, you will say he has to know config management tools, he has to know this tool, and so on. And there's so few expansion on, he sits together with the team, he can collaborate, maybe beyond, the obligatory, we are a very dynamic team and blah, blah, blah. Try to describe how you internally work together. And maybe you have somebody try, when you want him to work with you, having worked together with your people as a try. And don't focus on his technical skills. That's important too, but it's not that important. And it kind of brings me to this example of, a DevOps certification. What would that look like? You will see here the example of, logging into your Unix system. Do you want to remove a file? Yes, no. This isn't really an answer on whether he knows the skill to remove it or not. You want to hear his thought process. Okay, if I delete this file, what would be the impact? Can I recover this file? Like, who do I need to talk to? So you would be looking for those kind of answers that he's giving you instead of the fact that he knows how to delete the file. I'm probably sure this comes up in job interviews for non-technical people, that kind of more talk to you about your ability to collaborate and work together or lead people. But for technological people, very often they skip this step, this test on, how it's going to work together in a team. And because DevOps is so much about collaboration and communication, this is a very important part when you interview people or when you write your job description, what kind of person you'd be looking at. I don't know if you have an example on people within Serena that you kind of hire or work on the DevOps tools that. What are you looking for?
Well, a lot of it, again, and you're sort of hitting on sort of the cultural aspect, the teaming aspect, as opposed to the technical aspect, and because there's a lot of good technical people in some ways, but it's sort of all about how do you respond to change, and change might mean many different things. Change might mean, what if your job role changed? What if the tools changed? What if, and so I think try to get a gauge on that will enable you to understand and get a better perspective of how this person is going to manage as being part of this team.
Yeah, so it's almost like you will know that things will fail. You will know that things are going to change, and you will be looking at how somebody deals with those matters. And the fact that you can learn in something or willing to learn is more important than he just knows all the knowledge and he cannot collaborate.
So would it be resiliency over strength?
I think a lot of the architecture, but that's more in a technology way, are looking for being resilient.
Yes.
But I think you can equally apply it to people as well. You know, are the people resilient even if they don't know the answer? Would they call somebody? You know, would they reach out? Would they not just sit on themselves and, you know, mourn that they can't solve the problem? It's like, I think you would be looking more for extrovert people than you're used to in technology jobs. So that kind of brings me to, you know, you mentioned there's a lot of technology people you can hire. You know, there's less people being technology savvy that can well communicate. But the fact that they communicate with multiple people, that makes up for the fact that they're not maybe the specialist in their specific area. Because, you know, nobody knows everything. You know, you can't know and networking and, you know, front-end engineering and all these kinds of in-depth. But the fact that you are, like, willing to discuss and learn and, you know, at least get the interaction going, that's far more important. And, you know, you could argue about the fact that there are more efficient, but I think from experience, what I've seen most of the time, if you get a bunch of people collaborating on something, you will see great things. If you put them all in the corner in their specialty, it doesn't go that well, and you often need somebody else to kind of, you know, drive the discussion, and then it fades away, and then you kind of are the person somewhere as a bottleneck in the middle that needs to do it. So this brings me actually to the next part is, you know, some people, I said before, consider that putting DevOps in your job title is wrong because, you know, you can't be a DevOps engineer because they think it's, you know, it has to be cultural. I think you can be proud to put the word DevOps in your job title if you are a collaborative person. That makes you stand out. But suppose you bring the whole team together. I think there's this fallacy that you have to start with this all-star team of people working, you know, the biggest and the brightest working together. I'm not saying this doesn't help, but, you know, even in the all-star team, they might have these side preferences, or they want to negotiate special terms, or, you know, it's really hard to find that special team. I think what the goal should be is that you might start with, you know, a small team to drive the change in your company, but you should be able to expand it to the whole team. I made a comparison with Agile, where I haven't specifically heard of an Agile team in a company. Well, they're maybe at the start, but eventually the idea is that everybody of the whole company is doing Agile, and the same with DevOps. So, because otherwise you'll be creating that one new silo in your company where the bottleneck will become, you know, everything has to go through the DevOps room. It doesn't really make sense. And it might be very tempting to do it, but I also think it isn't wrong to start a DevOps team as long as it isn't a permanent thing and just a transition to, you know, finding a success in your company and building on there and then spreading it to the whole enterprise.
Right. Maybe the job of that team is to embed into every other team and spread the DevOps culture, right?
Yeah, that would be a very good option, you know, as a goal, is that they kind of keep spreading, and then they rotate the team and spread it there, and then, you know, there might be senior people in a way, but it's not that you just keep them all together in one group. So yeah, that's a good idea. And then, you have all the people, you hire them, you made a good selection, and then this part will obviously come up. You need to convince management, and then they'll be looking for a DevOps thought leader. This is kind of, tongue-in-cheek, I know. It's a repo somebody created. I wouldn't, people consider me a DevOps thought leader, but, it's very hard for me when I get a question, come into my company and talk about DevOps and help us. And I will explain why I find it very hard. You know your environment better than me. So if you ask me to come in and have this kind of 1, 2, 3, 4 setup scenario to do DevOps, I cannot give that to you. So my first thing is always like explain the problem you're having and make that collaboration with the client instead of doing a presentation and making, a path to DevOps on slides and so on. So I usually suggest having an open space session within the company to discuss what the things that go wrong. And if you're sincere about it, this will bring up your bottlenecks, in all this area. That's probably the most important to address. But if only one person says, we should tackle this bottleneck, that person only has one view of the system. So remember the picture of the elephant? Everybody has a side view on where things are at specific layers. And you need to have that discussion. And unfortunately, I found that it is very hard to find that bottleneck, the correct bottleneck. Obviously, you can just pick a bottleneck like, hey, let's do continuous delivery because, everybody seems to be doing that and we probably have our bottleneck. But it might not be your bottleneck. So be aware when you're kind of putting your hands into the ideas of a DevOps thought leader. And he says, let's do A, B, and C, and, this is kind of the path we're on, because you'll probably have to constantly adjust. And that's the hard part. It's I expressed that before, when your bottleneck moves, kind of, pick up the new way, pick up the new bottleneck, and address that. So it's a continuous discussion you need to have. And that kind of brings us to the discussion there is on enterprise DevOps. It's been 5 years, and after 5 years, people are now discussing enterprise DevOps. And a lot of the time you hear talk like, oh, but all these big web companies like Netflix and Etsy and the poster child of DevOps, they have it so easy, they're not having to respond to legacy, and they are often called unicorns within the when people talk about them. But what I want to make clear is that when people talk about these companies, they have a history of about 5 to 6 years to get up to the level where they are now. So I often say there aren't DevOps unicorns. They just became very trained horses. And that's what you should be aiming for in the enterprise. The problem is you might be bigger and other horses, but it's still possible to train yourself and to do that. So don't take the idea that, it works in these special environments. It only works for startups, for small companies. As a side note, when I was really thinking about Agile and system administration and so on, I spent 15 years in government. So I understand what an enterprise and a big system is, and I believe they're very applicable in the ideas. It does take a longer time to turn the ship, but it is possible. So I do want to give you the heads up that, it's going to be hard work when you go for it, and it's going to take a long time to train every course, but it is possible to do that. And then obviously, we hired people, we had the thought leader come in, and then we figured out what we need to do. part of the question you need to ask when you do a DevOps initiative, why is the word DevOps now in my company making such a big change? Like, what was the reason we weren't doing all these DevOps practices or ideas? I have never heard somebody who said, like, I asked my boss to improve this in a DevOps way, and he said no. So why did it actually block you before your DevOps initiative? And that's a very hard question to ask, and it's not something to do with technology or code. It has more to do with the mentality in your company that you're trying to change. And that's probably going to be your goal and your hard part to find out. So the important part as an enterprise is to listen. I've observed a lot of people from the enterprise, because they're so big, they're used to, more telling how things should be done. And, I've been enterprise architect, and, I know how that works. But it is very important to know to listen. And it's one of the things that is probably the hardest and seems like childish advice, but I think it's actually the hardest part, is to listen why things fail before your DevOps initiative. And that's kind of also part of, your internal feedback in your cycle. If you, let's say you go into a boardroom and people say, we want to do DevOps, and you ask them, why you're doing this, and, do we really have that problem that we're trying to address? They're trying to listen, and they say, well, you don't know how it works here. It might be that they're just not listening to what you're saying, and then, the fact that you're driving a change process might not have an impact anyway. So for me, this means that whenever somebody tries to sell you something, whether it's DevOps or not, keep expanding the ideas and don't stop, listen to the smaller companies, the bigger companies, the unicorns, internally in your company, share things out, because there is not one specific environment. Your environment is specific, your bottleneck is different, and your system is different. And that's where you should be thinking about. And, I wish it was as simple as 1, 2, 3, but, there's 1, 2, 3, and then there's again another 1, 2, 3 for the next bottleneck, and then 1, 2, 3 for the next bottleneck. So keep expanding it, and whether it's in dev, and ops, or HR, or in security, or in databases, or networking, or in sales, it doesn't stop there, and it's going to be ever repeating what you do. And, coming back to the fact of not writing a manifesto, it's really hard, when you don't know what the bottleneck is, to kind of write that up front, instead of, inspect and learn and try some of the practices that you read from others. If it doesn't work, reapply, try something different. And I don't think there's a set in stone DevOps procedure we have, so you still have to think, I'm sorry. So, where can you get some advice? I've listed a few of the books that I think are interesting to read. Web Operations book was one of the first, but don't get fooled. It isn't only on web operations. It goes also on collaboration, on people working together. There's Lean Bites, kind of written from people in the trenches trying to apply DevOps principle and their journey. If you want to hire DevOps people, there's a good book on there. Obviously, Continuous Delivery. And then there's kind of 4 DevOps kind of podcasts you can listen to: Food Fried Chill, DevOps Cafe, Chip Chill, and the rest of DevOps. There's sometimes technical, sometimes cultural, so it's kind of good work together. And then there's 3 other books which are probably more appealing to a C-level: Lean Enterprise, the DevOps Cookbook, which is coming up, and then the Phoenix project. So, and then there's the DevOps weekly mailing list that gets you every week, a bunch of interesting links. So if you want to get started or get some good advice or ideas, these are some good homework to go for. And obviously, there's the DevOps Days conference. We're doing them now. We're almost all over the world. From San Francisco, we've done some in Brazil. The only thing we haven't done was Legoland, but who knows? And a lot of people are there. And what's interesting, this is an open culture, so part of the sessions are talks in the morning. But in the afternoon, there is a very open culture of sharing problems, discussing things. Whether you're a big company, small company, startup, it doesn't really matter. People are trying to adapt and learn, and it's a great way to kind of get together with people who are struggling or trying to find solutions or inspiration to continue their solving their bottleneck. So, and you guys are sponsoring it, so great.
Fantastic. Thank you. It's a good time to wrap up. And first of all, say a big thank you to Patrick. Thank you for joining us and sharing your thoughts with our audience today about the first 5 years of DevOps and the next 5 years. It's a fascinating topic. It's a fascinating movement, and we're happy to be part of it and happy to have you here talking about it. I want to mention to our attendees that we do these DevOps drive-in webcasts every month, featuring all kinds of topics. Next month in September, we're going to talk about database deployments. And it is drinking time in Belgium, so with that, we'll say again thank you to our attendees and our speakers, and we look forward to meeting you again here next month.